It all began in the small town of Mount Hollow, where faith was woven into the fabric of daily life. The Hills family had always been devout members of the local church, where Pastor Gideon, a charismatic man in his 50s, often claimed to speak directly with God. His sermons were powerful, filled with vivid imagery and passionate calls to faith. But it was his prophecies that had earned him the unwavering loyalty of his congregation. One Sunday, during a particularly intense service, Pastor Gideon stood at the pulpit, eyes closed and hands raised. "The Lord speaks to me today," he intoned, his voice low and trembling. "He has a message for the Hills family." Evelyn and Robert Hill sat up straighter in their pew, their 3 teenage children exchanging nervous glances. The congregation fell into a hush, the weight of divine expectation hanging in the air. "God has a plan for your family," Pastor Gideon said, pointing a finger toward them. "He has chosen your youngest, Abigail, for a great purpose. She will lead many to the light, but only if you follow the path he has set before you." The Hills family was both stunned and honored. Evelyn clutched Robert's arm, her eyes brimming with tears of joy and reverence. Abigail, a shy 14-year-old, looked terrified, her wide eyes darting from the pastor to her parents. Robert nodded solemnly, already accepting this prophecy as truth. In the weeks that followed, the Hills' lives were appended by the prophecy. Robert and Evelyn began treating Abigail differently with a reverence that confused and overwhelmed her. They insisted she spend more time in prayer, limiting her social interactions and schooling. They believed her spiritual training was more important than anything else. "You mustn't waste time with the distractions of the world, Abby," Evelyn would say, gently but firmly. "God has a special plan for you." Abigail, who had once been a regular teenager with friends, school, and hobbies, now found herself isolated. Her siblings, Jake and Hannah, were less convinced of the prophecy. They noticed how unhappy Abigail seemed, but were too afraid to question their parents' new obsession with her divine calling. The church, too, began to treat Abigail differently. She was called upon to lead prayers, even though her voice trembled with fear. People spoke about her in hushed tones, as if she was already touched by the divine. The pressure mounted, and soon Abigail began to crack under the weight of it all. One night, Abigail confided in Jake and Hannah. "I don't feel special," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I don't want to be some prophet or chosen one. I just want to be normal." Jake, always the skeptic, shook his head. "I never believed that prophecy, Abby. It's just Pastor Gideon stirring things up. Mom and Dad are caught up in it to see how it's affecting you." "But what if it's true?" Abigail whispered, her voice breaking. "What if I'm letting everyone down?" Hannah, the most empathetic of the 3, took Abigail's hand. "You're not letting anyone down, Abby. This is too much for anyone, especially for you. You should talk to Mom and Dad." But when Abigail tried to explain her feelings to her parents, they wouldn't hear it. "This is just the devil trying to steer you off the path," Robert said sternly. "You need to pray more, Abby. We'll pray with you." As the pressure grew, so did Abigail's anxiety. She began to have nightmares, vivid visions of failing some unknown, divine test. She became withdrawn, her once lively spirit crushed under the expectations placed on her. Then, one day, it all came to a head. During a church service, Pastor Gideon asked Abigail to come forward and share a vision she had supposedly received. Abigail, pale and trembling, stood before the congregation. All eyes were on her. "I don't have a vision," she stammered, her voice barely audible. Pastor Gideon frowned. "You must, child. The Lord speaks through you." "I don't want this," Abigail cried out suddenly, her voice rising in panic. "I never asked for any of this." The congregation gasped. Her parents rushed to her side, but Abigail stepped back, shaking her head. "This prophecy isn't real," she shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. "I don't feel chosen. I don't feel special. I'm just me." The church fell into stunned silence. Pastor Gideon's face turned a shade of red, his authority crumbling before everyone's eyes. "This is the devil speaking," he muttered, trying to regain control. "She's been led astray." But it was too late. The congregation, once so sure of Pastor Gideon's prophecies, began to murmur among themselves. Doubt, like a ripple, spread through the room. Some began to question the other prophecies he had given over the years. Abigail ran from the church, tears streaming down her face, with Jake and Hannah following close behind. That night there were no prayers, no talks of destiny in the Hills household. Instead, there was only silence, broken by the quiet sobs of a family whose faith had been shaken to its core. In the months that followed, the Hills family began to distance themselves from the church. Abigail slowly recovered, but the scars of the experience remained. Pastor Gideon's influence waned as more people began to question his authority, and eventually he left the town under a cloud of controversy. The Hills, now free from the weight of false prophecy, learned to rebuild their lives this time, with Abigail at the center, not as a chosen one, but as the daughter and sister she had always been.